In 1997, William Strauss and Neil Howe published The Fourth Turning, a book describing their theory of how each generation would adopt one of four personas in a continuous cycle of a high, then awakening, then an unraveling, followed by a crisis, before the cycle restarts with a new high phase. In the high phase, institutions are strong in comparison to individualism. Society is confident and united, and there is a general atmosphere of moral conformity. Strauss and Howe identify the period of post-war America from 1946 until the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963 as a high. The end of each phase is referred to as a turning. After the high comes the awakening. In this phase, institutions are undermined by those who feel stifled by the conformist nature of society. Individualism clashes with social discipline, and the period of the previous high will be rejected as a cultural wasteland. The authors identify the period from the mid-60s until the 1980s as an awakening. The next turning brings about the unraveling, which can be considered the opposite of the high phase, where individualism triumphs over weakened and decaying institutions. Society becomes atomized and consumerist. According to Strauss and Howe, we have been in an unraveling phase since the 1980s, and the next turning will bring about the crisis phase. The crisis will often involve war or revolution. Institutions are destroyed and replaced with new priorities in response to the previous conflict. At the end of the crisis phase, a revived spirit of collectivism and purpose restores social trust and ushers in a new high phase. The authors identify the period from the Wall Street crash in 1929 until the end of World War II as the last crisis phase in the United States. Each generation that has its formational years in a different phase takes on one of four archetypes. Prophet or idealist generations are born in a high phase and are often overindulged, leading them to become self-absorbed crusaders of an awakening when they mature as young adults. An example of an idealist generation would be the baby boomers. Nomad or reactive generations enter childhood during an awakening when young adults are attacking the established institutional order. Consequently, nomads often grow up as neglected in comparison to previous generations, maturing into alienated post-awakening young adults. An example of a nomad generation would be Generation X. Heroic or civic generations entered childhood during an unraveling, an increasingly individualistic phase, and will come of age during a crisis period. They are often optimistic reformers with a more collectivist outlook. An example of a hero generation would be the Millennials, apparently. Artistic or adaptive generations come of age during a crisis and in an era of increasing institutional power, leading artist generations to grow up as overly socialized and conformist adults of a new high phase. I have always found Strauss and Howe's generational theory to be interesting and thought-provoking, but ultimately it is too rigid an analysis, and I share the view of many that it is ultimately unfalsifiable. As certain historical events can be cherry-picked as a sign of turnings, while other events that do not support the theory are downplayed. While I believe Strauss and Howe are correct in that there is a reactive dynamic between generations that has an impact on the course of history, I feel they overplay its importance at the expense of everything else. The claim that seems most contestable in generational theory is that the Millennials are of the same mold as the GI or greatest generation. Even if you could draw some similarities, there are also some startling differences. If you were to look hard enough, I'm sure you could find evidence of people complaining about generational entropy in every era in any civilization that ever existed. This doesn't mean that sometimes they aren't correct in their assertions of decline, and it seems hard to argue that we are not currently experiencing generational entropy in the post-war West. It seems a widely held belief that since the silent generation of 28 to 45, it has been nothing but downhill from there. From the overindulged selfish boomers with their pie-in-the-sky idealism, to the nihilistic and aesthetically barren Generation X, to work-shy snowflake millennials, and now the current holders of the title Youth of Today, the much-maligned Zoomers. In this video, we will examine how the post-war concept of cool has played a role in accelerating and exacerbating the cyclical reactions between generations we've seen in post-war Western youth culture, and why there might just be hope for the Zoomers. Curtis Yarvin once said, "When the dissident right becomes cool, we will win." But what does this word cool even mean? The first instance of the usage of the word cool in the modern sense that I have seen is on the Birth of the Cool Jazz album, released by Miles Davis in 1957. It was around this time that the post-war concept of teenager was beginning to take root.
You've only got to look and listen to be quite sure that all these young people have got hemp. They're most definitely with it. This is a high-class joint. But everywhere, the cats have their own little places where they live the gospel that this is the age of the teenager.
Oh, love, why don't they understand this little world called love? Why don't they understand?
Youth 1958 with a lingo of its own. What's it got to say for itself?
This is us, see? We're today. If you don't dig us, shoot away some square joint to the rest of the creeps. Well, why not stick around and get with it?
From that club to Lady Lewisham's a far cry. But wait.
Lady Lewisham, what do you think about our teenagers?
I think they're splendid. And I'm delighted you've asked me that question, because I sometimes think they get rather a raw deal.
Well, why?
I've met very many teenagers up and down the country when I've been travelling around, and I've been always particularly struck by their enthusiasm about everything, by their new ideas. I like the idea that they want to wear gay clothes, and it is in this country ideas that we certainly need. And I think that after all, one must remember the extraordinary things that one's parents and grandparents did, all their latest crazes, which seem to us just as extraordinary now. I'm always very bored with people who say, oh, young people aren't what they were in my day.
And ever since, the definition of cool and each new generation of teenagers have been intrinsically linked. This is why nothing can ever be too cool for too long, except on that rare occasion where some idea, object, or person stands the test of time and achieves a seemingly permanent cool status, overcoming the boundary between fashion and style. It appears that since the 1960s, each decade has been defined by a concept of cool that is in some ways a reaction against what was considered cool in the previous decade.
You think rock and roll's dying?
Yeah, of course. It's all big business. It's 1977. Rock and roll is dead, and be a few bands that keep it alive for a while, maybe till I don't know.
A reminder of the potential pitfalls of using cool to sell your political philosophy. You must take care to reach the level of style, as if you are a passing fad. you can expect a backlash. To illustrate, take this image of Sean Connery, photographed back in 1964. He has retained an undeniable essence of cool that the aesthetic of the San Francisco hippies has not maintained. Most cool phenomenon begin as an underground counterculture movement, gaining increasing popularity until it becomes commercialized and diluted for the masses, resulting in it becoming tired and cliched and causing the next emerging cohort of teenagers to react against it. In the 1960s, youth was defined by the hippies. Then in the 70s, it was the turn of the punks. Idealism and flowers gave way to nihilism and safety pins. The 1980s returned to a more optimistic outlook and became synonymous with the yuppies in their pinstripe suits, who were a reaction against the punks, embracing the corporate world with their gadget obsession and rampant materialism. Growing up in the 90s, you could feel the beginnings of a cultural reaction against the obsessive work ethic and ambition of the yuppies, in the form of the increasingly popular archetype in 90s pop culture, known as the slacker.
Attitude problem, McFly, you're a slacker. You remind me of your father when he went here. He was a slacker, too.
The seed of this cultural fad was sown in the 80s with characters like Spicoli in Fast Times.
Why don't you get a job, Spicoli?
What for?
You need money.
All I need are some tasty waves, a cool buzz, and I'm fine.
And Ferris Bueller, glamorizing the easy life and outsmarting the fastidious Nimrods. As life imitates art and art imitates life, the phenomenon grew. Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure became a cult classic, a story about two slackers who become leaders of a united world civilization by writing a cool song. Beavis and Butthead were kings of MTV in the early 90s, quickly followed by the first appearance of Jay and Silent Bob in the film Clerks in 1994. From that point on, most 90s teen movies contained at least one ubiquitous idiot stoner character. 1999 saw the release of the clearest outright attack on the banal soullessness of corporate America, Mike Judge's Office Space. Once again, the story revolves around a slacker who beats the system by a combination of charm, intelligence, and luck, and winning the ultimate goal of the 90s slacker, living the easy life with Jennifer Aniston. The slacker was not a purely American phenomenon. Two particular examples I remember from the UK 90s television were Matt from Game On and Egg from This Life. Matt was an agoraphobe, permanently attached to his couch, who lived off the rent from the 3-bed flat he had inherited from his parents, while constantly criticizing everything and everyone around him. Egg decides to quit his job at a law firm so he can stay at home, read football transfer speculation on CFAX, and get stoned while living off his girlfriend. Despite this, for some reason as a teenager, I can remember thinking that they were both really cool. In music as well as television, the slacker attitude was omnipresent. The runaway success of Nirvana's Nevermind marked the end of the era of 80s synth pop, now being reinterpreted through synthwave. In the UK, the Britpop scene had a more optimistic outlook than its grunge counterpart in America, but it was still awash in the slacker attitude. As Jarvis Cocker observed in the song Common People, in the 90s, poor was cool. The 90s were the formative years of the generation we refer to as Millennials, which also happens to be my generation. Coming from the earliest millennial cohort, I found myself surprised by the seeming contradiction in how it felt growing up as a millennial and the attitudes that came to define us as we reach maturity. In adulthood, the millennials were the snowflake generation, the vanguard of velvet totalitarianism. People often note the upsurge in woke terminology in the press around the beginning of the 2010s and conclude it was the result of the implosion of Occupy. But this was also the time the first millennials began to turn 30 and would have been starting to gain some influence in the workplace. One reason why it always felt a paradox to me that millennials became the cancel culture generation was the pop culture that defined the early members of the millennials were complete anathema to this worldview. On both sides of the pond for early millennials, the TV show South Park and the rapper Eminem were things that you would have heard about. Both these icons of the late 90s have resisted cancellation, where Nobel Prize-winning scientists have not. But I've always felt bemused at how the edgy and offensive humour of the 90s gave way to a culture of woke puritanism. A generation is a strange but unavoidable unit for chronologically categorizing segments of the population. But it seems obvious that those of us born in the early 80s shared a formative experience more similar to the last members of Generation X than our fellow millennials born in the mid-90s. This is why we have the concept of Zennials. The separation of millennials into early and late outlooks suggests that the cycle of social change is accelerating. Perhaps one reason for this was that as Zennials, more of us experienced the 80s action film era, possibly the last time any positive notion of masculinity was portrayed by Hollywood. This was also reflected in the children's television of early millennials. Transformers, He-Man, Thundercats were all swimming in positive masculine archetypes compared to today's mainstream output. In the 90s, nostalgic reminiscing about children's television became a cliched conversation. Although I, for one, consider the 1986 Transformers animated movie to be one of the greatest films to ever have been made, and the value of stories of this nature for young boys growing up should not be underestimated. Perhaps one of the most striking differences between the 90s and today is in comparison, it was a period of blissful harmony between the genders. Unlike in today's atmosphere of simmering animosity between the sexes, in the 90s, boys and girls were friends. The cultural impact of hugely popular TV shows like Friends on their viewers was noticeable at the time. It was obvious when boys imitated the mannerisms of Joey, while girls often subconsciously adopted Phoebe as their preferred character to emulate. Ross and Rachel were undoubtedly the Romeo and Juliet of the 90s, but their on-off relationship set the trend for the Gamma nerd wins girl of his dreams through perseverance romantic storyline that has dominated mainstream pop culture ever since. The parasocial relationships we form with these characters can have a powerful subconscious influence, almost equal to our interactions with real-life people. Scenes such as this may have a sweet romantic idealism about them.
Are you handsome?
Let's show him.
Just a sec, Dad. Actually, be cool. Just be cool. Okay, Dad.
Rachel, ready or not, here comes your knight in shining. Oh, no.
Bye! Okay, oh, dear. Jack, how do I turn this off?
Press the button.
Which one? Which button, Jack?
The button, the button.
I can't believe you did that.
Yeah, well.
but it is ultimately an unrealistic portrayal of actual human behavior. While some may argue that the show contained many elements of subversive tropes, it was like a utopia of harmony between the sexes compared to today's media output. The first Zoomers were born in 1997 and turned 18 in 2015. They are a generation that came of age just as the culture war began to become the central theme of Western politics. This means that in comparison to the worry-free 90s slacker dreaming of the easy life, white male Zoomers in particular have grown up in an atmosphere where many Western institutions appear actively hostile to their interests. When a living organism is penalized by comparison with other members of its species through losing the use of a particular organ or faculty, it is apt to respond to this challenge by specializing in the use of some other organ or faculty until it has secured an advantage over its fellows in the second field of activity to offset its handicap in the first. The blind, for example, are apt to develop a more delicate sense of touch than is usually possessed by people who enjoy the use of their eyes. Somewhat similarly, we find that in the body social, a group or class which is socially penalized either by accident or by its own act or by the act of other members of the society in which it lives, is apt to respond to the challenge of being handicapped in or altogether excluded from certain fields of activity by concentrating its energies on other fields and excelling in these. One of the negative effects of the slacker mindset is that it is not conducive to success. It is quite possible that many potentially high-achieving citizens instead became drug-addled layabouts. Each generation will produce a certain percentage of highly intelligent individuals. But the more of these that fall by the wayside due to lack of effort or ambition, it becomes more likely that they will be replaced in positions of power by the less talented but harder working and more ambitious striver. It is becoming painfully apparent that more and more top-level positions across sectors of vital importance are being filled by people who are simply not up to the job. This is leading to a crisis of competency, where the complex systems upon which Western civilization depends begin to break down. This concept was covered in depth recently in a Harold Robertson article reviewed by Morgoth. While the striving for ever-increasing diversity has undoubtedly played a role in the competency crisis, as we enter the era where millennials are turning 40 and beginning to take positions in the upper echelons of our most valuable institutions, I can't help but think that the slacker attitude that would have captured many of the early millennial youth and could have prevented them from reaching their full potential, thus decreasing the available talent pool even further. We have just witnessed the chaos caused by the UK air traffic control failure, but perhaps the most famous incident of the competency crisis is the fire on the USS Bonhomme Richard, where a $1 billion amphibious assault ship was lost because the crew neglected to push a button that would have released fire-suppressing foam due to their inadequate training. The first Zoomers turned 18 in 2015, coming of age in the middle of the social media battleground that was Gamergate, and probably formed the majority of the movement's foot soldiers. For someone who turned 18 in 1999, it is incredible to think how the outlook had transformed in that 16-year period. From one of boundless optimism to one of impending civilizational collapse. How would these vastly contrasting formative years mold the Zoomers differently from millennials? Having spent the last 3 months working with a small sample group of Zoomers, there seem to be two noticeable differences between Zoomer youth culture and the millennial youth culture I grew up with in the 90s. The most apparent being the almost complete disappearance of the slacker mentality and its accompanying widespread drug use. Zoomers don't seem to go out and get completely wasted to the extent or with the regularity that we did in the 90s. Slackerism and drugs have been replaced by social media and fitness for the Zoomers. While elements of the slacker drug culture still exist within society, it is no longer de jour among the cool crowd. As the culture of bodybuilding has grown since the 1950s, it has now reached a point where it is a common feature of most young male Zoomer lives. When you consider the Arsenal side that won the First Division in 1991 contained 2 alcoholics, many Zoomers, particularly CrossFit lunatics, take their fitness more seriously than some pro athletes did in the 90s, with many essentially addicted to exercise. This has some positive implications, but can become an obsession that eclipses all else and heightens the sense that the Zoomers are a uniquely uncultured generation, either without a concept of or a focal point for any essence of the sacred. Perhaps this is why they are so obsessed with tattoos. It is almost as if the Zoomers are the first generation where the evolution of mankind into 2 separate species, predicted by H.G. Wells in The Time Machine, is beginning to look like a real possibility. The Zoomers seem a generation that contains many highly attractive but also many repulsive individuals. Combined with the low overall birth rate in the West, if the top and the bottom ones are the ones producing the most offspring, this will exacerbate the process. Although what path it would take and the moral repercussions that would follow are far outside the scope of this video. Post-war youth culture has gone through a cycle of rejecting and then reinterpreting its previous eras. But at the dawn of the 21st century, the internet was about to change the fundamental structure of youth culture altogether. The traditional mainstream alternative binary was about to be fragmented into 1,000 pieces as the reach of the internet made the cultural gatekeepers redundant.
All right, so how do I join you? If you want to be one of the nonconformists, all you have to do is dress just like us and listen to the same music we do. Okay.
While Zoomers may represent an easy target, with clips like this becoming more and more commonplace on the internet, the resources are available for the more conscientious and intelligent ones to be vastly better informed about how the world works compared with when millennials were their age. And we can only hope that there will be enough diamonds in the rough to reverse the tide of entropy in Western civilization, even though it may seem unlikely. And we should hope that the Zoomers will be able to rise to the challenge, as the consequences for failure can be severe. By the 2040s, the early Zoomers will be turning 40 and beginning to form the mass of the professional managerial class. By this time, the challenges and pressures on Western civilization will have undoubtedly increased. If the Zoomers are not up to the task, you may well see the lights start to flicker. An example of this process is unfolding before our eyes in South Africa. Back in 1994, there was nothing but hope and optimism for the Rainbow Nation. What has happened over the last 30 years is painfully reminiscent of neighbouring Zimbabwe's experience under Robert Mugabe. Blackouts of up to 12 hours are common, trains no longer operate, and stations have been abandoned and are now raided by scavengers for copper and other metals. 6 out of 10 young South Africans are jobless, and it has one of the highest murder rates in the world. What has transpired in South Africa is not what the Western intelligentsia, who hero worship Mandela, had predicted. We would be foolish to think it can't happen here.
Rick Miles' last cryptic message.
You fucking know. You don't know?
No.
Viewers, you don't know who the cameraman is.
No
You
one.
don't know why you're being paid to see these things. Nor do I. You're seeing me. I can't even see you. I may be dead by the time you watch this. Very possibly are. You don't know who's the man who's making things he wants you to see. Destroy your television sets. Now. You must listen to no orders. That's all I can tell you at this point of the moment. That's how it touches.
I didn't understand it.